Lily, before we talk too much about Jack Fertility and everything that you're doing around there, and I do want to really dig into that, I want to know, and I want people listening to kind of get a bit of an understanding about who you are. And when we spoke last, you just had this really interesting view of the world and kind of story, I guess, your kind of life story may sound a little bit grand, but let's go with it, your life story. But I would love to get people to kind of understand, who you are. So Lily, why don't you just kind of start us off? What do people need to know about you to kind of get what you're all about?
That's a great and a bit heavy question for Friday morning. What
I'm
am
just
I?
going
What do
straight
I
in there.
stand for? No, I love it. No, and actually that's frankly like kind of who I am is I definitely fall into the category of like being told I take things a little bit too seriously. I always try and balance that with a bit of humor. But I guess I can sort of, and what anyone listening to this kind of needs to know is that I'm a very sort of values and purpose driven person. And currently, my actual full time job outside of, well, really part time, but should be full time job is working for the Oxford Character Project. So I came to the UK, clearly not well, not necessarily British from my accent. I came to the UK in 2019 to go to the Said Business School for my MBA. And there I was hoping to do a lot more work on my personal leadership style. So, hoping to become a better manager, be a better leader, and sort of position myself well to be really impactful, not only to the work that I was doing, but also to the teams that I would lead. And through that process, ended up meeting the executive director, Ed Brooks, who has been an incredible mentor to me. And when I was thinking about starting Jack, ended up giving me this amazing opportunity to work alongside him. And jumping ahead a little bit, my CV kind of mirrors what we work on, which is looking at values and purpose in industry. And just taking a step back from that, like what people need to know about me is that that's sort of what drives everything that I do is how can we make other people's lives better? Can we optimize? If you do like Clifton Strengths or any of these other personality tests, like I always come out as the one who's just like trying to execute, make things happen, being decisive, while also probably taking things getting a little bit too in the weeds sometimes. So even my answer can just sort of say that's kind of what I'm all about is trying to make the world a better place, but also considering like how that impact affects individuals in particular on a short and long-term basis.
I love that answer. And we often hear, organizationally, often hear kind of the importance of values. People often put their kind of, these are our core values for the organization, but so often those aren't lived values. They're not really represented in what you see around the organization. But the sense that I've always had from you and in reading bits on LinkedIn and whatever else about you, it just like, you don't just talk about these things, you espouse them. You kind of really, they're a part of you. I almost think that if I cut you open, your values would be sewn into your skin somewhere. Like, that's a pretty weird thought. Sorry about that. I've gone a bit too far.
That is great. No, because frankly, that's great. That's great feedback because that is pretty much literally what I'm trying to do. I think one of the greatest things that's ever been said to
Yeah.
me and sort of through growing up is like sort of you can say whatever you want, but if your actions don't show it and don't or aren't the proof, like everything from performance management at your work to how you show up to your friends and family, like to me that really is, I always try and sort of take a retrospective of whatever period of time and be like, was I performing at my highest level, like was I able to do that? And that's also something I think I have to counter personally, and what I would remind people listening to us is that I think we have a real emphasis always on best, like are we doing our best and pushing. And I do a lot of coaching and mentorship work, and a lot of what I end up advising people and what I see, not only I'm a rowing coach, and I see this a lot in my athletes as well, as in sort of people going through academia and through their early careers, is that they think they need to be performing at such a high level at all times. And frankly, it leads to this mix of burnout, overexertion, and underperformance on the long term. So I mention this because that I really, really appreciate you saying it, because to me that sort of means that sort of what I'm hopefully again what I'm preaching is showing up in practice.
Yeah, no, it's clear. It comes through so strongly, and it's a real joy to hear, genuinely. And I love that idea. So we're all guilty of this. Striving perfection, performance being the key thing, productivity being the most important thing in business that we're hearing so often these days. But actually, there's this such an important other part of our existence that we need to be kind of conscious of, and now we're starting to get to this point of really understanding the importance of well-being, very broad-based kind of well-being, as well, both in our work lives, in our life lives as well, our personal lives as well. Yeah, it's such an important aspect. I'm really interested. Like one of the things that I found here, in kind of having a look around LinkedIn, doing little bit of LinkedIn stalking, was that you talked about since childhood you've been so passionate about changing and improving healthcare, the healthcare industry, making products and services that are innovative, customer centric. I'd love to hear a little bit about that very early life. Like what was that childhood like? How did you know that was something that you were interested in at that stage, and how do you kind of reflect back on those early years as kind of getting you to the point that you are at now, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, hindsight's 2020. So to me now, it's so clear. I'm like, of course, all of these decisions I made and late nights, worrying about things. Obviously, it all got me to this point, but it certainly didn't feel like it at the time. So I think that's one thing I would just sort of say off the starting plate. But yeah, I really, to the point that we talked about before of values and sort of knowing what I think I've just had an advantage of being one of these kind of intrinsically motivated people to want to make the world a better place. What I think in my case, I also knew that I wanted to do that in the right way for me, which is could be perceived as selfish. But to me, in the way that I was looking at things at the time, is that I want to maximize the value. Again, seeing this whole theme of like to me like being able to make the maximum impact. And so in some cases when I was quite young, like I didn't know about a lot of roles, and I think this is something I talk about a lot again in mentoring conversations, that I was lucky enough to grow up with two parents who work in academia. My dad's a professor, my mom's a librarian, and so I grew up on university campuses, actually all over the world, which I was again lucky enough to do. But to me, I was really always drawn to the sciences and to observing phenomena and sort of understanding the world around us. So even from very small, I was always, looking at, plants and bugs and all of those things. I was lucky enough to have been exposed to a lot of that. And then I think as I got older, you develop a love of whatever you're interested in. And for me, alongside art and music, actually, which is something that I've, you have different phases in your life. For me, it ended up being biology was sort of what captured my interest in its intersection with chemistry and physics. And I grew up in sort of the southeast of the US. And in high school, I ended up moving to South Carolina and got into the Governor's School for Science and Math, which is a residential public boarding school. So students really, really, shouldn't say this on a podcast, but really, it's a bunch of the nerdiest kids in the entire state, like the most high performing little weirdos that you've ever met. So earnest and so pure in their love of the sciences. And we all get put in this incredible environment in Hartsville, South Carolina, where we all live in a big building and take classes kind of at the university level. I was 15 when I went, and
Wow.
yeah, it's an incredible concept because we literally were from all over. My hometown was about a mile square, and so going from that environment to a place where people were from all over the state and all over the world as well. A lot of people had sort of super diverse backgrounds. Some people's family had never left the state of South Carolina, so exposure to that diversity all the time, 24/7, was absolutely amazing and totally opened my eyes to not only what existed within the field of STEM, but what existed within the field of sort of human experience on a micro scale. And then for me, because I loved STEM so much, I just sort of got addicted to taking all of these classes. I ended up sort of looking at great science programs and thought I would stay in the Southeast for uni. But I ended up getting recruited to go to Wellesley College outside of Boston, which is an all women's college, one of the first women's colleges in the US. And for me, I didn't really have the words at the time, but Wellesley was incredibly impactful in the sense of like, I didn't even know to what extent sexism was affecting me, but I knew that something wasn't right. Again, from this kind of first principles approach of phenomena that I was viewing in the world, of seeing that, people, despite being equal, weren't being treated the same, despite all these
Mm.
other sort of all else being quote unquote equal. And often that would be due to gender, it would be due to race, it would be due to sexuality. And at the time, I didn't quite realize, like, to your point, was it something that I like planned and knew? No, it was just, I really wanted to do something different. I had never really been to the North before as a Southerner. Thought it would be an amazing opportunity and frankly got a great scholarship. So at the time, I just thought, this is new, this is different, this is so cool, and I can study biology and my courses count for some credit. Because, of course, when you're young, you're like, I've got to get through this as quickly as possible. Um, but at the same time, like I also only knew about the medical professions at that point because pretty much everyone that I knew was either a professor and worked in higher education or was a teacher of mine. I knew the theory of lawyers, which I can talk about a little bit later because I did have a brush with law, or healthcare professionals. And I mean, the few other professions you ever see. And to me, I thought, oh my gosh, being able to be a physician and have such a direct, like, impact on improving the health of people's lives, especially growing up quite rurally where there's so little access to healthcare. I thought, what more noble of a profession that it aligns with my academic interest, which was science. But then, thankfully, as I went into undergrad, started taking courses all across Wellesley's liberal arts college. I ended up discovering so many fields that I didn't even know existed. So found my sort of first real love, which was philosophy. I took an ancient Greek philosophy class just because at the beginning of every science class you hear about Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and they have a cute little pithy quote. And you're like, how are these people who are 4,000 plus years old still so relevant? And they had a whole course on
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
a requirement, right? So I was like, great. And discovered exactly the way my mind works. I mean, the questions that I grappled with, these sort of late at night, why are we here? How do we live a good life? Like, what is the point? And sort of sophisticated ways to inquire about that and write it in a clear way, and communicate and really get to the heart of a lot of those discussions. So, yeah, and meanwhile, I was shadowing a lot. I was like trying to really, again, sort of to our conversations as well about like trying to challenge assumptions and really get to know what you're actually doing, because in theory it sounds great. Like I'd love to, the lifestyle of a physician sounds a bit brutal, but it sounded really great and gratifying. And so I shadowed GPs, I shadowed some specialists, I shadowed dentistry, and all of them I realized that, I mean, deep down I'm just a big softie, and so I just, every patient I saw I would just think about all the time. And I was just so worried about like how their outcomes came out. And through the mix of that and my junior year at Wellesley, I won a grant to be able to go to Washington, D.C., work in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and sort of be on the front lines of health policy. So going to the Senate, going to different meetings on the Hill, understanding Social Security. Through that whole process, I started seeing the reality of not only what it's like to be a physician working, in a greater system, but also how kind of broken that system is. And especially thinking about, realistically what my career would be. And at the time, I was like, yeah, if I go to med school, I'll probably start properly practicing in the 2020s, probably have a 30-year career to 2020, or sorry, 2050. Excuse me, my early morning math. But for me, very realistically, looking at those timings, I was like, there are going to be so many drastic changes that I'll have to contend with. And then as a physician, regardless of my practice, I'll have to have some of this is US centric specifically. But to me, I
Mm.
was like, I'm going to have to contend with so many of these changes coming down the pike. And knowing that personally, I would have to spend so much of my time changing who I am fundamentally to have that professional distance. I just knew I couldn't commit immediately after undergrad to a field that I saw had, frankly, so many red flags, both personally and professionally. So yeah, I'll pause there because that's a really long-winded way of answering
Wow.
your question, and I can definitely sort of go
No,
in.
but what? Yeah, I mean that's exactly what I was hoping for in asking that question, and you've painted the picture so vividly, and so much interest there as well. I've got so much interest in deepening my understanding of that journey. One of the things that kind of comes to mind is that you seem to try so many different things, and just I might be wrong here, but it feels like you just went, yes, I'll do that. Let's see what's going to happen. Let's just explore. And it's just kind of that, maybe, again, maybe I'm perceiving this wrong, but it just looked like you took every opportunity that was presented as an experiment, almost as a way to kind of go, I don't really know. I don't know what my destination is going to be. And I think about this a lot with regards to career building. You know, I'll often a lot of people think, I want that job. I want to work with that in that world or whatever. But often I think actually direction is better than the destination. You kind of know, I want to go in this broad, around health, maybe healthcare kind of world. At the moment, that looks like it's the doctor route, kind of into the proper medical world, and becoming a physician, maybe. But actually, with each one of those steps, new options appear, and you just seem to. I don't know. Is that how it felt at the time? Like, yeah, I'm just going to go and try this. How did that? How do
Yeah,
you think it felt at the time?
yeah. I mean, to be fair, yes, like that's exactly how I approach things, and I think I'm able to do that for two reasons. One, I had an incredibly supportive family who never pushed anything on me. I mean, aside from just sort of saying, we want you to be happy and we want you to be fulfilled, and also the sort of duty to others, to support others, and to give back to your community. It was never, you have to be a doctor, you have to do all of these things. I mean, there were, especially coming from academic world, there was a very strong call to have a licensable profession for the job security aspect of things. But I think for me, I mean, also to just sort of reflect too, is that part of why I think I was able to do that too is because I was such a young teenager when the global financial crisis happened, and I so vividly saw how people who'd worked their whole lives had their like sort of whole security shaken in such vivid ways, both the people I knew really well as sort of observing that. And I think a lot of people of that generation, and sort of frankly all I guess all people. I don't even want to limit it to any age group, but I think when you see something that fundamental and then also get through it, the sort of survival complex of that is that you see it's just not that serious. You can bounce back, and that's a very privileged thing for me to say. But I also see so much human resilience, especially as you meet more people who've been through so many different tragedies, through so many, and when you have the amazing privilege of surviving, frankly, you just sort of realize that everything is, you can go back and you can, there are very very few doors that ever actually close. And so for me
Right.
that was it, is that I was like, so what if I do something and it's a bad time, like, yeah, it wasn't ideal, but I have another chance. And that's sort of, I'll share a little bit more too about how I've approached a lot of my other career decision making, is because that mix of just sort of seeing something happen on a global scale, but similarly, like even with uni choice, like I don't at all regret going to Wellesley. It was really hard, and was it fun? I wouldn't term it as fun. A lot of people, sort of like, uni was the best, it was amazing. I'm like, wouldn't really want to do it again. However, that's why you go to grad school, right? Like there are master's degrees, there are doctoral degrees. This is a whole industry, right? So if you want to have a different uni experience, even, I'm always like, yeah, just try a different uni. Which, yeah, I do. I hear the privilege in what I'm saying, but I also think that people, I think every decision, whether it's, a text you're sending, an email you're sending, all the way up to like, do I do this with my life? Like people feel like it's so irreversible, and nearly everything is reversible. And I learned that very quickly at a young age. And the saying yes, right? It's like I always say yes to a call. I always say yes to some of these relatively. I try to say yes to the low stakes things, because often they open up big doors that you can also close. I mean, that's the thing is, for me, another example is my junior year of high school, we had this incredible opportunity with Roche Pharmaceuticals where they just decided to take three students to Germany, because we had to do a summer research project. And I was like, I don't know anything about Germany, despite having a German last name, which significantly did not work in my favor when I went to Germany because everyone assumed I spoke German. And I was like, the last Elsner is probably left, or at least in my branch of the family. It's apparently quite a common German last name. They left about 200 years ago and did not pass the language down. So this is a fun perk of being American. Yeah, but that was it, right? I was like, so what if I go to Germany, I have a bad time, which I didn't. I had an amazing time. It was incredibly formative and extraordinary. But I was like, whatever. If I don't like the food, if I don't like the people, like all in all, it feels like this is going to be the rest of your life. But really, it was like a 8 to 10 week internship that, I mean, I got through whether I loved or I hated. And so I think just having the ability and also the support system to be able to say, look, that sounds like a lot of time, but it also, in the grand scheme of things, isn't. And being able to do that math of like whether that is a deal breaker for you in your circumstance at the time, I think is really critical.
Yeah. Wow. I feel so. I mean, I felt good before, but like you're just bringing this enormous positivity, this belief, and this this reality of like decisions can be switched, decisions can be changed if you're not loving what you do. And one of the things that I talk about quite often with the work that I do, with organizations around making decisions. The best thing that you can do is the right decision. I think it was Rumsfeld that said this, right? The second best thing is the wrong decision, and the worst thing that you can do is not make a decision at all, right? Is nothing. So even if you make a decision, it turns out to be, well, that didn't work, something needs to change. And you've changed your careers a bunch of times. You were talking about medicine at one point. I think you like did a bit around law as well. Is that right? Am I
Yes, yeah, I can
remembering
share
that?
that whole
Yeah, and switch
story.
things. Yeah, but that kind of trying things out, not figuring or not worrying that this is a decision for life, and that early those early seeds were sown very vividly for you, it seems, as well. And I think one of the other things that I kind of reflect on here is that what it seems like is that you have this amazing view of the world and where the world is going, and taking in all of those kind of macroeconomic or like cultural changes that are happening, but also an amazing reflexive process as well, where you're kind of really looking internally at what you want to be doing, and kind of making those decisions based on those two completely contrasting worlds, I guess, yourself and the rest of the world outside. So it sounds like yeah, what a lesson we could all learn, I think.
That's very kind of you to say. I think one, I just in response to that, I think you're right in the sense of being able to take a pause and take a beat and remove yourself from the situation is one of the most like beneficial things you can do. And I do say, I mean, I had to develop this skill. This isn't something, I mean, in some senses I was kind of born that way of like just frankly being slightly curmudgeonly and just like not wanting to engage with certain things. But I also think that through the iterative approach, I mean, I take the example like to not go to medical school, right? Like I was like, I wanted to be a physician, since since I knew what a physician was, and since I had a little Sesame Street kit, of like, oh, we can, check on the boo-boos and all of that. I was like, oh, amazing. And to, go to STEM high school, study biology, you do all of these things, and all of a sudden it's like everyone's like, obviously you're going to med school. And I'll say for that, I mean, I thought I was going to go to med school up until the second I decided not to. And for me, that was probably the first time where I just really realized that. I was like, I don't want to do this. And normally I'd always push through it, been like, no, I'll keep studying, I'll keep, playing the sport, I'll keep committing. And part of that is, everyone talks about character development, and part of that is really important, is to push through, and be resilient, and to grapple with those hard things. But then I think part of it was just being under so much pressure, so much self-imposed pressure to do that, and then just
Right.
realizing, who cares? Like, frankly, who cares?
Yeah.
The only person that actually cares is me. And if this is making me so unhappy that I'm developing insomnia and I'm having all these issues, like, why am I doing that to myself? And I really credit actually my mom and my family members for pointing that out to me. They were like, "Who? We are not making you do this. Like, what? Who's telling you to do this? That you're so worried about upsetting?" And it was just so profound to me, because I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't have a good answer. Who is making
Yeah.
me, and who cares? Who at the end of the day? And part of that, like, people have family pressure, and I certainly have felt that too. Like, I want to give my family and friends something to brag about and be proud of me for. But I also think that there's also so many other ways to succeed, that because that's the amazing diversity, especially with the internet, that you see so many different ways people are making these positive impacts. And then instead of being so worried about fitting into a certain mold, you're like, no, that's not going to work for me, because I can do something really amazing with my skill set. And rather than, I think another really profound thing that I ended up learning while I was working is, especially in regards to performance management, people talk so much about working on your weaknesses and strengthening your weaknesses. And to a point, that's really important. But beyond that, I started realizing, I was like, why am I trying so hard to fix perceived weaknesses, which frankly are actually only weaknesses in that context, when I could just be trying to increase my strengths and get stronger and stronger and stronger at the things that really set me apart, and frankly make me an asset to the team, rather than me perceiving myself as a weakest link. And that was also part of why I was like, especially being at such a competitive school as Wellesley, where we all think we're terrible. And I observe the same thing at Oxford all the time, because it's such a storied
Mm.
institution and people put so much pressure on themselves. But it's one of these amazing things where you're in a context, because you're really good at whatever got you there, and then you're with all these other people who are also really, really good at that thing. You perceive yourself as being terrible, but all it takes is removing yourself from that situation and remembering, one, that other people have really important strengths too, that aren't necessarily selected for by an admissions committee. Um, but at the same time, you are really, really, really good at what you do, and being able to do that without the pressure of assessment and competition and all of that just sort of means, yeah, exactly. You don't have to do this alone, but you also can make a huge difference, with what you're doing. So hopefully that's clear. That's a bit of an abstract example, but I just really wanted to make sure
Yeah.
I hammered that home.
Super clear. Yeah. And again, there's so many things I'd love to we could have this probably podcast for several hours, I think, to be
Yeah.
honest. Um, but one of the things, a couple of real quick ones, like that thing about being proud of, and other people being proud of you. When I think of my own children, I'm more proud of their kindness and compassion and their resilience and their happiness at times than I am of their achievements. It's that makes me so proud. When we went to my mum's for dinner a couple of weeks ago. My brother was there, and my brother's wife just said to me a few days later about my kids. She said it was just so good to see them confident and able to have these conversations, adult conversations, not talking, not trying to impress people, not trying to. And it was just that made me heart melt and so proud. Forget whether they got A's or whatever it is in their exams. Those moments are what really matters, what really counts, and that's what I think is important for me, and I think is what other people I think could be important for other people as well. One of the other things I wanted to talk about is I was I fell into this trap as well of thinking that I should focus on my weaknesses. And I
Mhm.
remember a situation. I was in a startup. I was in the leadership team of a high growth startup. We were doing pretty well. We'd gone sort of in a couple of years, got to sort of 7 to 8 million revenue in a couple of years, and so we're on this good curve. And I remember my boss, I was in a leadership team, but my boss, the CEO, basically said, Spencer, like, I'm seeing that you're just a shit leader. You're, you're, you really need to work on your leadership skills. You need to be harder. You need to be firm with people. You need to give people exactly what they need to do. And I just wasn't that. I'm not that micromanager type person, and that just wasn't for me. And I was like, right, yeah, got to work on these skills. Got to be better. Got to be harder with people. And a few weeks later, someone that was that worked for me in my team, she said, what happened to you? Like, you used to be this servant leader that would get rid of all the shit so I can do great work. And then suddenly you're imposing all these different views and different ways of doing it. And I'm struggling now. I can't work in this way. And like that moment of like your view of leadership and your view of my weaknesses, that perception you have of weaknesses that I have, is your perception only. And actually I need to follow those strengths that I have and really lean into that ability to clear the shit out of the way of the people that are beneath me and working for me, working with me rather, to be able to collectively do the best work that we can. It's my job as a leader at that point, or I felt it was my job as a leader at that point, to make everybody do their best work. And that was what my role kind of became. But yeah, it's so difficult when you're caught up in these views from other people about what your weaknesses are that need to be developed, but actually leaning into your strengths and becoming the best that you can at those things, I think is so important too.
I couldn't agree more. And like, good for you. That's such an amazing example of precisely. It's a phenomenon that's well documented, but especially, I mean, I live in Oxford. I'm at the business school all the time, and a really dear friend of mine, Susanna Kislenko, she studies founder syndrome, which is when a founder starts sort of taking a really territorial view of the company and imposing his or her or their vision on everyone and expecting like this very specific way of doing things, and the micromanaging happens. And I've definitely worked in many companies where this has happened. And it just shows, the thing is like, especially when you're data driven, right? And this is again so important, like you got that feedback from your direct report, and it's really important to cultivate an atmosphere where people can say that, because otherwise that employee could have left. She could have just been like, I'm not doing this
Yeah.
anymore, and silently gone away, and then exacerbate. And one, you're losing probably a great employee, and two, you're also having to contend with the fact that that culture is just going to decrease and decrease and decrease. And hence, I so appreciate you sharing it, because it's, again, this is why we study what we study at the Character Project. And frankly, what especially now being a founder myself, which is kind of a surreal thing to even say, I'm still getting used to it, is, yeah, even in a culture of just me and my co-founders, like, how do we make sure that we're not slipping into that and trying to impose our way of doing things, and like really challenging each other on, is this the right, not even the right way, but is this the most effective way? Is this the sort of way that
Mm,
we actually want to show up and do the hard work that is pretty hard to do? So, yeah, an amazing
absolutely.
example.
Thank you. I'd love to dig in. Let's change direction slightly. I'd love to dig into where you're at with Jack now. Talk to me actually a little bit about the founding story. Again, a little bit of stuff on LinkedIn. If it's okay, I'm going to read out what you've written about where you're at, or what Jack Fertility is all about, and then I'd just love you to kind of explode this out and kind of really, for us to really understand where we're at. So it says here, I want to read this because because I think it's so good,
Okay.
and I just want to make sure that everyone really kind of gets it, and go and check out Lily on LinkedIn as well, by the way, because there's some amazing stuff over here. There's an aeroplane. I'm just going to pause for that in case you can hear it.
We
It
have one
says we're on a
here.
mission. Yeah. Oh, yeah, there we go. It says we're on a mission to remove all barriers to males' reproductive health in the UK. We aim to empower all people with sperm to start taking control of their fertility journeys. We're developing the UK's first male-in semen analysis kit, offering lab-grade semen analysis results without setting foot in a clinic, to help men and people with sperm better understand and improve their fertility discreetly from home. I mean, there's so much there of like the challenges around this world, around this issue, that you just seem to be kind of nailing. I often think about these as terms of jobs to be done, right? What is the job that needs to be solved? What are the progress that people are looking for in their lives? And this just kind of brings that all to life in a really interesting way. But I would love to hear from you. Like, it's a really interesting kind of direction of travel. I like how did this come about? What's the founding story of Jack Fertility, and how did you think this is the founding is a really big thing? How did you go? This is the thing. This is the thing I really want to focus a lot of my energy, time on. And yeah, tell us about that story.
Yeah, happy to. And thanks for reading that out because we put a lot of work into writing that very specifically. So, yeah, happy to share the story. So, this when I mentioned I came to the UK for business school, I showed up on the first day and had an amazing study group. So at an MBA, usually you're put in a group of like 6 people, and they're very intentionally diverse. And you work with the 6 on all of your first terms assessments, and really have to sort of navigate all of the challenges that come along with 6 people from all corners of the world. And they've become very dear friends, including my now co-founder, Nick Shipley, who originally I just bothered him so much because I was like, I love British television and grew up watching it. And he was the first like British person that I was able to like just totally interrogate about every single show. And ultimately he said, I think you've watched more British television than most British people, which was both great and terrible feedback. So yeah, we became fast friends, loved working with each other, and in the next term, Hillary term, we started hearing about COVID, and then all of a sudden, we as a friend group were more excited about he and his wife were having their first baby in March, and ended up having the baby on the first day of UK lockdown. So he and his wife had to end up navigating becoming parents and living with their in-laws, both sets of in-laws in one house, and navigating like all healthcare from home with a newborn. And he deferred the MBA to the following year. So meanwhile, I was trying to be a supportive friend, and we stayed in touch and we're sort of going through all of the lockdown stuff together, getting really used to mailing in our tests from home. And I finished working I finished my MBA and then started working locally in Oxford for an AI drug discovery startup as their head of strategy, and started thinking a lot about the greater life sciences landscape, where trends were happening. And as Nick came back to Oxford to finish his MBA, we started hanging out a lot and talking about just sort of the difficulties that he'd been having with the baby, and sort of thinking about the fertility sector as they were thinking about their second. And for us, initially it just sort of came out of just pub chats, honestly, of talking about fertility. And I, of course, with my good Wellesley degree, was always talking about like why is the woman always the one to bear the fertility burden aside from having to bear the pregnancy, or the person with the uterus. And for so many months, we just started playing with the idea, and Nick started sort of exploring it within um, the MBA coursework. And part of that was to our conversation earlier, is we just wanted to try this out. It was like there's so many different interesting things happening in the world, but what we discovered and what really got us interested in this is that it seemed like no one was looking at this male fertility. Like to this day, every time I say, "Oh, I'm working on a male fertility startup," people say like, "Oh, what?" Or they talk about sort of the few trends in that area. It's either, oh, are you doing contraception? Or, oh, are you doing potentially like any of the sort of traditionally male diseases? And I'm like, no, no, we're just allowing people to find out the status of their fertility, which I just was floored because again, as a woman, I had my fertility tested when I was 18, just as a part of another procedure. So I've been lucky enough to know, at least at that time, that everything was fine, and that in the back of my mind, I never
Mm.
really realized like how empowering that was in many ways until I started looking into this and started realizing that one, I mean, biologically female people have a really hard time finding out their fertility, particularly in the UK. And globally, it's a really privatized industry. There's so many barriers to getting tested. And for women, it's incredibly painful, involves all sorts of awful procedures. Versus, as we kind of say flippantly, it's like it's really, frankly, quite easy for men, certain situations notwithstanding. And so for us, we were just like, why is no one doing this? And we just couldn't get it out of our heads. Like, why is no one doing this? So we spent about 6 months, very intensely interviewing pretty much all stakeholders that we could think of. So we kind of mapped the ecosystem of male fertility, the mix of a customer journey or a patient journey more specifically, and just looked. It was like, who would you talk to? What would you Google? Like, what would, and why do we think we know? Let's talk to really diverse people, different age groups, all of those things, and really trying to challenge every assumption that we felt like we were baking into whatever claim we were making. And through that, we simultaneously found, one, there's just not a good reason. There's not a good reason this isn't a standard practice. I sort of put my scientific hat back on and just did a lot of database research on what's been published in this area. Nick sort of put on, his background is in fast moving consumer goods marketing and customer insight. So we just sort of applied those frameworks. The MBA sort of really helped us think through just the different ways that different people have put forward not only product development roadmaps, but also just like, how do you solve a problem? I love that you mentioned like jobs to be done. We used a couple of those different ways of thinking about developing a product, because we didn't want to say, oh, people would love to mail in their sperm. Like, it's not a phrase one I thought I would ever be saying, but it also, like, the reason we ended up not even coming up with that, but sort of solidifying that that was the reason, is that most of what we found in our research was that men just didn't want anyone to know that they were getting tested. And so the primary issue is that, so sorry, I should back up and say, so for right now, for a person with sperm, you have basically two options to get tested. You either can go in person to a clinic, and in that case, it's either on the NHS or private healthcare. On the NHS, you have to be actively trying to conceive with a partner for over 12 months to get on a wait list. And then you have to wait. Don't really get much choice, depending on your trust, on when that appointment is. So you might have to travel really far. You may have to take time off work. You have to go in person, produce a sample, usually having talked to a lot of different people. You have to produce a sample in an office. The reason for that is because you only have 1 hour before the sample is ostensibly dead. And you can't actually like tell what the health of the sperm is. So it's a 1 hour radius, or it's really half an hour radius around any given clinic that someone could sort of bring in their sample if they didn't want a sample in a clinic. And you've probably seen films and that sort of thing. I mean, it really is that bad, or frankly
Yeah,
worse
yeah.
in some cases. And then same thing for private. You're usually paying around £200 plus a variety of other fees. Same thing, transportation, very limited availability in terms of appointment times. And yeah, just a really awful, awkward, emasculating experience. Plus the fear of like, what are those results going to say? And so usually people only do this if they're having trouble conceiving, or if they're worried, not even worried, but people I've found, especially under 35, are starting to proactively test, which was another reason we got really excited about actually doing this. So that's the in-person experience. And then the at-home experience, there are a couple of different devices that can be used. There are a few different at-home tests where you have to you have to handle your own sample. So a sample is produced, a device is used to either like look at it microscopically, or to using your phone, your actual phone, which frankly just has an ick factor. Or there are only a few parameters that are tested. So the WHO has 5 major characteristics that you have to look at for any given sample to be able to sort of accurately say what its health is. And basically for us, we were like, surely you can keep that sample testable. I mean, it's very commonly done in sort of animal husbandry. And so we basically just figured out a way to do that scientifically. Ended up meeting our co-founder, Miriam, who is an embryologist, is finishing up her PhD at Oxford here in reproductive medicine. So, and she was like, yeah, of course. And we just sort of put our heads together, and we had the mix of like the background of how to build the tech, but we also had this sort of extraordinary, from my background of working at Capital One Bank, which is all about sort of delighting customers in terms of financial services applications, and then Nick's consumer insight stuff. We were and coming out of this incredible ecosystem in Oxford, in the greater sort of southeast of innovation, and we just were like, this is let's why don't we not only make a better way, but like the best way, and then be sort of proven wrong coming from like the very, very best. Um, yeah, so that is a long way of describing what we are building and
Wow.
how we decided to do that.
It's so fascinating. And I mean, I've like happy to share. Many years ago, I went through a process where I had to go to a clinic and I was in one of those rooms and it was incredibly awkward and icky. And I couldn't help but think, like, who else has been through this room right now? Who's
Yeah, of
been
course.
doing the things? It's just, oh, it gives me kind of shudders right now thinking about it. Just an overwhelming thing to go through because you're worried about so many different aspects of your own health, and future. Like, yeah, your future starts to go through your mind as well, and that's just, yeah, just an incredibly difficult and challenging experience. So anything that makes that just that little bit better, a little bit easier to start with, is just amazing. But equally, moving on from that, just to like you say, I really believe that sometimes the best ideas just seem so obvious to us, and as you said just now, um, like why doesn't this exist? Like, it just seems like it's such an obvious thing to be able to provide a service that you could provide that's needed. Um, yeah, why didn't it exist? And I love the fact that it was like maybe that kind of why me, why now, and it just all kind of came together for you. One of the things I'm really interested in is that, you had all these conversations, kind of exploring what this could be. There was started off with the kind of pub chats, but then talking to everyone, all the stakeholders, and mapping everything else, including the patient journeys. One of the things that we talked about previously is this idea of, validating assumptions, but equally it's trying to prove yourself wrong as well. And can you talk to that idea of, and I think actually just to help us along here, I think you talked about basically this kind of positive pessimist, you as a, that, that kind of expression. I'd love if you can to kind of bring that to life a little bit and talk about how and why that was an approach that you took, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I giggle at positive pessimist because it's a really good way of describing me. Like, I can be so grouchy, but I also like don't want to bring it down because again, it's just not that serious. To the way we introduced. Sorry, sorry. This is the danger of having windows open. Sorry. Hopefully, we can cut that. So coming back to
No
what it
worries.
was. Um, yeah, especially with regard to testing these assumptions, is that again, it's comes from, I think, my personally for me, it comes from my sort of coaching mindset, as well as having been a chief of staff. So I guess one bit that I've left out of my career journey is that, so after not going to med school, I decided, like any good philosophy major, I would go into law. I also saw that attorneys had a lot of power on the Hill. Thought, I don't actually know any lawyers that well, so maybe I should again do my due diligence before I commit to yet another extremely expensive grad school without knowing I really want to do it. So ended up working at a big law firm in New York City, having an amazing experience there, thinking I wanted to be an attorney, applied into law school, got in, decided I actually really had no interest in doing it because I got a role doing the type of law I claimed in all of my personal statements was my passion. So I moved to DC, worked for the board of directors of this bank, and basically said, yeah, I see why you pay attorneys to do this work and hire a law firm because I have no interest in doing this. Like, really, like turning the changes and like debating where these commas are and how this would be treated in litigation. I was like, oh no, no, I really do get why you pay someone. And then had an amazing experience sort of seeing how a bank is run, and then got hired as a chief of staff in the credit card business itself. And through that, I learned so much about how to manage and how to lead. I supported a really amazing senior vice president in the card data and analytics platforms and had some really incredible leaders that I was supporting, but really learned how to do retrospectives and sort of work in a sort of quasi agile format. So doing sprints, looking at how they turned out and whether that was in with regard to meetings or with regard to deliverables. And yeah, that sort of set me up for my post MBA experience. But the reason I bring this up now is because with my positive pessimism is that yeah, it's no fun to be around someone who's like, well, it's not going to work, and I don't think that's the right way to innovate. But for me, and with especially how often I even just said innovate, is that when people are thinking about doing something brand new, there is so much like excitement and possibility, which I love. And I sort of get that high of, discovering something and anything that could happen. But I also, it's less, I don't want to use the word realistic because I find that to be quite limiting because people's version of reality, a lot of people's version of reality is quite different than the shared version. But at the same time, I think being I really don't ever want to be in a situation where I'm like I should have thought of that or I could have thought of that, and it's inevitable. But I also like to hedge against that by having again a diverse team who challenges me. So for example, like my two co-founders and our larger team, I mean, I would never be like, oh, you're too much like me, you can't work with me. But I try to be mindful of like what their skill sets are and sort of in that, and really ask them about like, what would you do? Or like, am I off base with this? And everything from how we interact as like a team all the way through to what our strategy is and what we're trying to achieve. Because especially, and this is just so well documented through books and media, especially when you're trying to do something that hasn't necessarily been done before or specifically done before successfully, depending on your measure of success. It just, there's so many red flags that if you have the right team, you can see and sort of overcome that to, of course, uncover other major issues. But for me, I really think that it is this mix of balancing expectation as well as again a scientific approach of having hypothesis and sort of going from the null to is this not the case, and being really careful about how we phrase that so that we're also not creating data that leads us to the wrong assumption. So yeah, it's trying to kind of humanize the scientific approach is also what I would say is, really hoping that we're right, but also really trying to challenge ourselves and make sure that we're not sort of leading ourselves down the wrong path. um, and again, going on that journey together. I mean, it's just that classic, if you want to go far, go alone, or sorry, whatever the phrase is. But if you want to go far, I always think, going together and also having a really good time. We're on this earth for so
Yeah.
short amount of time. And I was lucky enough to grow up around my grandparents and great grandparents, and especially being around elderly people. And it's something I love to do is sort of be around people who've lived their lives, is that's the stuff they remember, is that like they wouldn't necessarily remember all of the deliverables that they did and how many deadlines they met unless they were really fixated on that. But it's so much
Yeah.
about the experience and how much, I mean, we all say this, but it's so true. And I have to remind myself a lot, especially when I get a little bit too serious about trying to live these values and live the purpose, is that it is about, going in, day out, and having a good time. Um, because that's what fills our cup. And again, I so appreciate you sharing your story of your situation. And frankly, through this process, I mean, I I can't in good conscience give this up because every time, and because the statistics are getting so dire about male fertility and the rising infertility, is that it's now 1 in 6 couples will experience in some form of infertility.
Wow.
Globally, sperm count is declining 2.6% per year. So this is only going to become more common. And at the same time, like you talked about and we sort of discussed, is that every time I go to a networking event, chat with someone like this, people share, and they've been through these horrible, horrible things, and through a mix of societal taboo and a lot of the shame, especially for men and people with sperm, about anything to do with their ability to have children. They just can't talk about it. And frankly, I do think this is where gender comes in, is that I, as a woman, um, because despite the fact that I don't yet have children, men are much more comfortable talking to me about this than, say, my co-founder, Nick, because I think there is this sort of like masculine, unless, I mean, he's a wonderful, very easy to talk to person, but there is a dynamic there where it's like, even though he has two kids and I have no children, I find
Yeah.
that people will be very open and vulnerable. I'm so honored that people do feel that they can share, but it also speaks to that latent, like they want to share, people want to talk about this, but it's there. When would you bring this up? Like, it's so brutal and it's so difficult. But to me, I think that's also hopefully where I can use some of my amplifying power, and while really respecting people's privacy. And I think privacy and data security is core to what we're doing here, and we're sort of building it in from day one, but also being able to anonymously be able to understand the trends, and from our sampling be able to sort of see whether things are getting better or worse. But my sort of final point with this is that the big thing about male fertility for me is that once people have just that baseline of just the initial semen analysis, they know where they stand. And there are so many things that can
Mm.
be done. It's highly, highly treatable. Um, it's just that people need to know, and people often, it's like I get the full mix of people, even in investment conversations, people immediately be like, "Yep, I've done one of those tests. Yep, we had an IVF baby. Yep," on sort of all aspects of the gender spectrum. But I also find so many people who are like, when I sort of, again, pub chats, just like, "Oh yeah, I'm working on this." People are like, "Well, why would men need to know their fertility?" And I'm like, I don't have time for the TED Talk, but it's pretty, one, it's kind of a human right, like just to be able to know what your health is. And
Yeah.
that's kind of a major, major thing for me, is that I just really do believe that a person with sperm, you can't visually tell from a sperm sample what its health is. You have to do the microscope aspect of it. And so I find this a lot with, chats of varying degrees of professionalism. People often are like, "Oh no, I know, I'm fine," and I'm like, "Well, yeah, even if you can conceive, like it's sperm's a really good biomarker of health. So often you can sort of understand like how well your body is doing by the health of your sperm." And so, it's not super common, but I do think with the rise of all of these issues, the how much this is going to affect so many people over the next couple of years, being able to be doing the best version of that, the best for the patient. And at the end of the day, the patient to me is the most important piece. The patient, potentially their partner, if they want to conceive, whether that's their outcome or whether they just want to understand how to improve their health on a sort of core basic level. That's really the vision, is to empower those people with sperm to be able to just know what their actual health is.
Yeah, and to know, and then to know, I guess, to make those decisions. As you say, there are so many options. There are so many treatments. There are so many things that you can be doing. There's maybe some lifestyle changes that can help with these kinds of things, and just knowing is perhaps the first step to a road to getting to where you want to get to. If you don't know where you're at, but you know where you want to be, then there's nothing you can do. If you don't know where you want to be, then equally there's nothing you can do. So if you know those 2 points, at least you can start to make those steps towards getting to where you want to get to. Amazing, Lily. We're running out of time, but I would love to carry on talking. But what I really want to leave with is just kind of understanding where you're at the moment with Jack Fertility, where maybe you want to be. Is there anything, and basically, where can people find out more? How can people support, get involved, do anything at the moment? Is there any way of doing that at the moment, or is that going to be something that's going to be coming? Where are you at, and where can people find out more?
Amazing. Thanks so much for asking. Yeah, so where we are with Jack is that, so we've secured a lab, which is so exciting, here in Oxford. We're at the Wood Center for Innovation. So thank you so much. We're really exciting because this is going to allow us to actually do much more robust testing. So I'd say actually, if you're in the Oxford area and want a free sperm test under ethically supervised protocols, you are more than welcome to reach out to us on our website or reach out to me directly. But we will have a more robust sign up sheet in the next month or two. Where we are in terms of building the business is that we've laid a huge amount of plans. We have some incredible collaborators and are really sort of building out how we will bring sort of an amazing product to market, including all the regulatory needs that we have. And so we are raising external investment as of this week, frankly. And so because we basically have everything we need, we just need to fund it. I've been lucky enough to have a lot of grants and have a lot of support, but it's really just having that sort of rocket fuel to be able to get this to market. So there's that, but also I think the biggest cause that everyone, like you mentioned, everyone does know something about this, even if they say, I don't know anything about sperm health. And I think sharing those stories is so important and compelling, and not even having to share a personal story. But one thing that we've been doing as an early stage startup, and I think anyone listening to this who wants to think about starting something, is that we have a blog on our website where we've been inviting collaborators and people who work with us to write just about what they know about sperm, whether about their thoughts on the industry. And so if anyone wants to participate in that initiative or even just be connected to this very small but growing world, I can also recommend the Him Fertility Support Group in the UK if you're listening here, and potentially you're going through any of the things that we've described. They're an incredible group of people, actually run by Ian Stones and his team at Test Him. And I think that's one amazing thing about this industry, male fertility in particular, is that it really is, among all of the different companies trying to work on this, and all of the fertility clinics, I'd say the overarching attitude is rising tide lifts all boats. So we're all kind of actively applauding what we're all trying to do and trying to support each other. But I do think that, especially for patients themselves going through any of these issues, getting connected with Fertility Network UK and the Him Fertility Group is really core and something that we're trying to work on building into Jack, as well as sort of into the larger male fertility conversation in Britain.
Wow, amazing. And I want to say just an enormous thank you for taking this on, for the work that you're doing. I think it's incredibly important, and I can only see it growing in that importance over the next few years and decades, let's be honest. So thank you for tackling such a big, challenging, highly stigmatized area but it's such an important part of our health and our future health, I guess, right? So thank you, Lily. This has been an absolutely amazing conversation. I drive through Oxford quite often. I've got family that live just the other side of Oxford from where I am. So let's get an in-person thing. Who knows? Maybe I'll come and donate and see what's going on with my sperm as well. But yeah, that'd be amazing. I'd love to come and see you in person and see everything that's going on. And good luck with the fundraising that you've got going on now. Do anybody that's listening this far that's taken an interest, and I'm sure if you started listening, you were still listening now. Get in touch with Lily if there's anything that you need to know around this world, or indeed if there's some big investors out there that want to give you loads of money. Like you know where Lily is now.
So appreciate it, and yes, you're welcome.
Thanks so much, Lily.
Anytime. No, so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great weekend and a wonderful week next week as well. Take care.
Thank you so much. You too.